Hi and welcome to the Windows videos. In this video what I wanted to do is talk about data size and how that relates to your internet downloads. So I'm going to have to talk a bit about the boring topic of data. I won't go into it with too much detail, it's just so you're familiar with the topic. So if you do see it when you're trying to sign up to an internet package, you understand what's going on and what they're talking about. I also want to quantify what all these numbers mean. It's all well and good to throw the numbers around at you, but unless you really can relate to something, you're not going to know what it means, and your eyes are likely to glaze over as I'm talking. I will keep it really simple. I won't go into too much detail. It's just simply a video for your edification, and it's not important to the overall scheme of things. So to get started, what we'll do is talk about bits. Now bits are what all technology is built around. It's your ones and zeros. That's what digital data is, ones and zeros basically. It's very small and you don't need to worry about it, but you will hear the term from time to time if you're talking about computers. When you get 8 bits together in a collection, they call it a byte. And I've separated that up here. You can see I've got 8 bits equals a byte. Now this data packet is so small that you don't really need to worry about it. But one thing you do need to note is that bits and bytes both start with the letter B. Bits is represented by a small b and bytes is represented by a capital B. And you'll see that later on as I show you an example. Bits are very small and only useful to you if we're talking about internet downloads. Once we get 1,000 bytes, we get a kilobyte. Now the reason I've separated bits and bytes up here is because it's different to the way the rest of the data is measured. When you have 8 bits, you get a byte. Nowhere else does that happen. The rest of the time you need to get 1,000 of one unit before you move on to the next unit. So if we get 1,000 bytes, like you do here, then we move into a kilobyte, and this keeps repeating. So that's why I've separated bits and bytes out, and you don't really need to worry about it. If we get 1,000 bytes, we get a kilobyte. Now a kilobyte is typically the realm of small text files, basic emails or really basic web pages. It's quite small and nothing you really need to worry about. Once we get 1,000 kilobytes, we then move into megabytes, and megabytes is where the bulk of your data sizes are going to be. So for example, a CD is 700 megabytes, most video files, pictures are in the megabyte range, MP3 files, they're also somewhere around the 3 to 13 megabyte range. You can see they're all capital B's, which means they're megabytes. If it was a small b, it would be megabits. The same goes for kilobytes and gigabytes as well. Once we get 1,000 megabytes, or to be precise it's 1,024 for each of these, but if we just round it to 1,000 it keeps it simple, we get a gigabyte. So 1,000 megabytes equals a gigabyte. Now gigabytes is your larger measurement of data, and that's where you're going to find things like DVDs, which are usually around the 4.3 gigabyte range, and high definition movies, which also are around 3 to 12 gigabytes in size. These three measurements are typically where you're going to work the most. You also get the terabyte range, which is 1,000 gigabytes, but files very rarely, especially for home users, go into the terabyte range. So these days you can pick up drives around the 1 to 4 terabyte range. They're very large capacity drives and obviously can store many movies or many MP3 files, but you're unlikely to have files in the terabyte range. So if you do know anything about electricity, you'll know that kilo, mega and giga are all units of measure for electricity, and it's the same thing with data, so it can help you remember if that's something you're more familiar with. So this is how we measure data on a computer. This is information and the amount of space it consumes on your hard drive. In this example we're referring to just static information. If you want to move this information around, then you're going to have a transfer rate, and this is where your internet download applies. What this refers to is information moving per time. So it's usually measured in the amount of data per second. So you can have 1,000 bytes per second, or 1,000 kilobytes per second, or 1,000 kilobits per second. And I'll show you an example now. So what we're looking at here is an internet service provider's plans for the broadband that they offer to residential customers. Broadband is a term they use for just fast internet. Typically what you're going to get is ADSL2. That's in Australia, and you can see ADSL2 here. There are other things. You can get cable modem. You can also get things like fiber optics depending on where you live. That may be available to you, and they're substantially faster. But if we look at this offer here in grey, we can see that the number underneath it is 250 gigabytes. That number does not refer to the speed. That number refers to your total limit for a month. bills usually come in a monthly cycle. So that number refers to how much information you can download in a given month. The speed of this service is a different thing, and they can't give you a fixed quote on the number that you can download at, simply because how fast ADSL2 is depends on how close you live to the provider's exchange. If you live close to one of their exchanges, you're going to get a really good transfer rate. For example, mine is somewhere in the vicinity of 12 to 13 megabits per second. If you live a little bit further out, that number is going to drop. That's why they don't give you a fixed number. However, one of the important things to understand is what happens when you exceed your monthly download quota. So if you download more than 250 gigabytes, which is still a fair amount of data. So if we consider high definition movies, for example, and say that there are approximately 10 gigabytes per each movie, you can download 25 movies in 1 month, which is a fair bit. Once you exceed this monthly quota, what happens is your traffic gets restricted. It gets slowed down to this number down here. And it's called shaped speed. What they do is basically restrict the pipe that you can access the internet with down to 256 kilobits per second, which is about 5 times faster than the old dial-up modems. So it's not very fast. But this is something you want to investigate, because some service providers will just keep charging you extra once you pass your monthly limit. So if you download 300 gigabytes, for example, you'll have to pay an extra 50 gigabytes in charges, and sometimes they can be quite expensive. So it's just something you need to be aware of, and you need to figure out what happens if you do exceed your limit. Preferably you want your traffic to be shaped like it is in this example. It means you can still access the internet, you just cannot download large movies or look at large video files, because your internet speed will be a fair bit slower. So hopefully that sheds some light on understanding what all the terminology is, and understanding how you measure data sizes and file sizes, and how that relates to internet downloads when you're connecting up to an internet service provider.